Welcome. This is the video lecture on price controls. I'm Professor Cherry. Up to this point in the course, we've been developing the tools that we could use to examine and understand markets. Specifically, we've been building the basic model of supply and demand. Now we're going to finally be able to put some of those tools to use in examining a couple of issues. 2 lectures, we're going to look at price controls and taxes. In this lecture, we're going to talk about price controls. So we're going to use the supply and demand model to gain some insights on how price controls affect markets and market outcomes. Now we ought to keep in mind that our model at this point is quite basic. So we're going to be glossing over a lot of issues that matter. There are more advanced models that consider those issues, but those models require more years of study in economics. But as you will see, even our basic model can provide considerable insights. So hopefully we'll be able to see the potential for economic models to help us understand markets and market outcomes. So we're going to consider 2 general types of price controls: a price ceiling and a price floor. Then we're going to introduce elasticities and see how important they are in determining outcomes. So price controls. As the name implies, a price control is a policy that establishes a minimum or a maximum legal price. They're often enacted in a time of crisis. They're also used for political motives. And price controls offers a nice example on how to use the supply and demand model because it also illustrates the law of unintended consequences. Price controls, as we said before, the political motives, you could have price controls that appear like they're helping people, but they have unintended consequences that lead to undesirable outcomes that are less obvious. So first we're going to look at a price ceiling. This is when you have a legal maximum price for which a good can be sold. So these policies are aimed at helping buyers. An example would be a rent control. With rent control, it sets the maximum amount that landlords can charge tenants for rent. So if you limit prices to be at or below a certain level, then that's going to help buyers. It's going to restrict what the seller can charge the buyer. There are 2 possible cases: non-binding and binding. And we're going to go through each one of these. And this distinction is very important in understanding price controls and its impact. So first, we're going to look at the non-binding case of a price ceiling. This is when the maximum legal price is greater than the market price. So in essence, if the market price is at P star, but the maximum legal price is above P star, then it's not going to have any effect. Let's illustrate this further. We're looking at a market without a price control. That should look familiar. It looks like P star and Q star at the intersection of the supply and demand curve. Now let's impose a price ceiling. So the only thing that we added to that diagram is a dotted line where P superscript C, indicating that's the price ceiling. And everything above that is illegal. So a market with a price ceiling limits prices to be below P superscript C. But P star is already below the ceiling, so it's not going to change the price. The market price is already within the legal range, so it has no effect. So now let's look at the binding case. This is when the maximum legal price is less than the market price. Then you're going to see this price ceiling have an impact on the market. Again, let's look at the market without a price control as the benchmark. And now let's impose a price ceiling that's below the market price. So in this case, everything above the ceiling is illegal, and P star is above the ceiling. So now the market price is illegal and can't be charged. The seller has to lower the price to the ceiling. So what does that do? That has an impact on quantity demand and quantity supplied. And it's going to create a difference. Prices are forced to go below the market equilibrium price, P star. Lower prices will decrease quantity supplied, and it's going to increase quantity demanded. So what you end up with is a shortage, because quantity demand increase, quantity supplied decrease. So now quantity demand is greater than quantity supplied. So the policy is forcing the market to be out of equilibrium. Let's look at it graphically. At P star, the intersection of the supply and demand curve would give you the quantity. But now that that price is illegal, the seller has to lower the price down to PC. So you move down the supply curve until you hit that price, and that gives you the quantity supplied. And as prices fall, you move down this demand curve, quantity demand increases, and you end up at quantity demand. Whereas before, quantity demand equaled quantity supplied in the equilibrium. Now that the price has been forced below the equilibrium price, quantity demand is greater than quantity supplied, and that is your shortage. So let's look at price ceilings in the context of rent control. You can have rent control that imposes a binding price ceiling or a non-binding price ceiling. So for instance, if a policy is passed that limits rent in your local town to not exceed $10,000 a month, right? So that ceiling is quite high, and the market rent is below that. So it's a non-binding ceiling. But if you put the maximum legal rent at, say, $200 or $300 a month, then that's going to be a binding constraint on landlords. So that's a binding case. And if that's the case, then that rent control is going to make rent more affordable to people, but there's going to have unintended consequences, because you're going to have fewer units available. When you have that quantity supply decreasing due to the lower rent, that entails landlords making decisions such as they switch over their units from being residential to office space. Maybe they're trying to get around that rent control. Or maybe it's not profitable at that rent control amount, so maybe they'll tear the building down and just have parking. All right, so you'll see the quantity supplied, or the number of units on the market, decrease with a binding price ceiling. But you'll also, on the other side, the demand side of the market, you'll see more and more people want those units. Because now prices have gone down, and whereas before you might have had roommates living together and with the higher rents, but now that they're forced to go lower, maybe they want to go out and find their own apartments. So you have this simultaneous divergence between the supply and the demand side of the market that creates this shortage. So if you have a shortage, that means you have more renters than rental units. So that opens up the doors for discrimination. That gives the landlords a lot of power in who they select to rent their units. So they might do background checks, they might do credit checks, or they might use unethical means to determine who they rent to and who they don't rent to. And then, of course, you have manipulation of the bureaucracy of this policy. Like in New York City, there's famous stories about rent control apartments being handed down within the family and haven't been on the market for years and years. So that binding rent control creates a lot of unintended consequences, even though the initial goal of creating more affordable housing is worthwhile, but maybe this isn't the best policy. Maybe a better policy would just be to provide direct rent assistance to people. So now let's look at price floor. And this is when you have a legal minimum price for which a good can be sold. So it's the inverse case of a price ceiling. So instead of a maximum price that you can be charged, this is a minimum price which you can sell for. And this policy is going to be aimed at helping the sellers. A good example of this are the agricultural price guarantees, which sets a minimum amount that the farmers are going to receive from the buyers for their commodities. And that policy is aimed at protecting the farmers from prices going too low and hurting their bottom line. So again, there's two possible cases, a non-binding case and a binding case. So again, we'll start with the non-binding case. And this is when the minimum legal price is less than the market price. Right? So if the minimum price is less than the market price, it's not going to have any effect on the market price. Right, so let's first look at the market without a price control as the baseline. And then we impose a price floor that is below the market price. So everything below that floor is illegal. Everything above that floor is legal. And the market price is above the floor. So that means that the floor has no effect on the price. In the non-binding case, you still end up at P star and Q star at the market equilibrium. So let's look at the binding case. And this is when the minimum legal price, the floor, is greater than the market price. So if the price is lower than the minimum, that means that it's illegal and it's going to have to change. So in this case, where the floor is above the market price, it's going to have an impact on the market. So again, as the benchmark, we'll look at the market without a price control, and then we're going to impose a price floor that's above the market price. So everything below that floor is illegal, which includes the market price, P star. So now the equilibrium price is below the floor, it's illegal, so it's going to have to be pushed up. It's going to go up to the floor. And as the price goes up to the floor, what's that going to do? That's going to decrease quantity demand, but it's going to increase quantity supplied. Right? Higher prices is going to discourage consumption, but it's going to encourage production. So let's go through this step by step. The price floor is above the market price. The price is going to be forced to go up, and as that price goes up, quantity supplied increases because higher prices that's going to encourage sellers to supply more. Quantity demand is going to decrease because the higher prices are going to discourage consumption. So you end up at a case where quantity supplied is greater than quantity demand. You end up with a surplus. Like the binding price ceiling, the binding price floor forces the market out of equilibrium. So the difference between quantity supplied and quantity demand is the surplus. Those are the units that are produced that no one wants. And this surplus occurs because the price is higher than the market would dictate otherwise without that policy. So within the context of price guarantees for farmers, the purpose is to protect the farmers from a bumper crop that might lead to low incomes. A bumper crop that leads to a big shift in the supply curve that drives prices down, and farmers don't receive the incomes that they were counting on. That's a worthwhile to consider as a goal of a policy, but there's unintended consequences. As we've just illustrated here, it's going to tend to lead to an oversupply of products. So we're going to have a surplus of commodities. We're going to have a grain surplus, maybe too much corn, maybe too much of other crops. So what do we do with these crops? A lot of times we send it over for foreign aid, but there are other times we just have to store it, have to do or dispose of it, and that's costly. So it's not only just we're generating a surplus that we don't want or no one wants to purchase, but we also have to incur the cost to deal with that surplus. So let's bring in the elasticity. So the extent of the impact that price controls have, in part, depends on the elasticity of demand and supply. So the extent of a surplus or shortage due to the binding price control depends on the elasticities of demand and supply. Of course, it also depends on how far below the market price or above the market price the binding control forces the price to go. The more elastic the demand and supply are, the greater the consequences of a given price control. The more inelastic demand or supply are, the smaller the consequences of a given price control. Take a step back, and this should make some intuitive sense, because prices, if consumers or producers are elastic in their demand or supply, then they're going to be relatively responsive to price changes. So price controls are going to have a bigger impact if demand and supply are elastic. Right? If demand or supply are inelastic, by definition, that means that they're not very responsive to price changes. Right? So a price control is not going to have as big of an impact on a market with inelastic demand or supply. So let's look at an example of rent controls with elasticity. First, we're going to look at the market for rental units without rent control. And you'll see that you have an equilibrium price and quantity, P star and Q star, and you have the demand curve and the supply curve. And what's unique about this is that we have a vertical supply curve. And that indicates that it's perfectly inelastic, but it also is vertical because the number of units in the short run is fixed. Right? It takes time to build new units. So in the short run, the supply of units is fixed at Q star, meaning that it's perfectly inelastic. So let's impose a price ceiling or a binding rent control. So now everything above this ceiling, PC, is illegal. So it's going to force the price, P star, down to PC. So what's going to happen is quantity supplied stays the same in the short run. Right? So the number of units is not going to change in the short run. But in the short run, the quantity demand is going to change. Right? You can see that it creates a shortage where you still have quantity demand is greater than quantity supplied, but it's not as great as it would be if the supply curve was not perfectly inelastic. So now let's look at when that happens. In the long run, when the landlords have more flexibility, they can either build more units or they can convert existing units to other purposes, or tear down buildings and put in parking lots, or convert residential units to commercial units, or just let them decay over time. Right? So in the long run, supply becomes more elastic and the supply curve flattens out. And as that happens, you can see that the shortage becomes more and more severe. Right? The difference between quantity demand and quantity supply gets larger. So this is an example of how elasticities help dictate how severe the consequences are from price controls. And that's the end of this video lecture. As always, read the text, review your notes, revisit parts of the video lecture that are unclear to you, and feel free to send me emails with any questions and take the quiz as scheduled.